So welcome everybody. Welcome Royal Roads community here in this room today, and also live streaming. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity to talk to you about research that I am near completing, a study on faculty accounts of their experience in communities of practice here at Royal Roads University. I just want to give a little bit of background on this study. So this study is part of a doctorate in education. It's the doctoral thesis that I'm completing, and I started the doctoral work in July 2015. And so this is a doctorate in education through the University of Liverpool, and it involved 9 10-week courses, extensive reflexive practice, and then the completion of a practitioner-based study that with a focus on application. And so this is where I'm at with my research journey, and it is a pleasure to share with you this study and the progress that I've made. So I also, we have had an acknowledgement of the ancestral lands, and I do want to reiterate that we're here on the ancestral lands of the Songhees and the Esquimalt ancestors and families. And you know, every day I think about what that means for me and my teaching, and for what it means when I come onto these beautiful grounds here at Royal Roads. And so it's with gratitude that we're here today, learning, working, sharing, and in community with one another. So here's the agenda, and before I just actually go into the agenda, I have a few thank yous to make myself. So I do want to thank the university for the scholarship leave that I was provided. It was a very significant leave for me because the timing of it was perfect in terms of this doctoral research. So I was on leave from September 2018 to February 2019. And so I want to thank the university for that. And I'd also like to acknowledge all of the faculty who participated in this research. There were 15 faculty members that participated in either a focus group or an in-depth semi-structured interview, and I really appreciate their time. And I also want to thank everyone here at the university that has been involved in some way in communities of practice, which probably means everybody, because there are varying degrees of formality in communities of practice. Some of them are extremely informal, and you're in one without you perhaps really noticing. So they're generally informal groups. And I think there's kind of variation on how informal they are, if you like. But they're wonderful groups of people that come together and share their passion and interest in a topic that's important to them in a community, with a particular emphasis on their learning and the practice implications of what they're sharing. So I want to acknowledge those people that are involved in communities of practice, either here at Royal Roads or out in their communities. And I'm very interested in connecting with anyone here who would like to discuss their experiences in them as well. So here's the agenda. So we're going to have a little warmer, because I like to do that. An introduction to the study. I've given you a little introduction. I'll say a little bit more. I'm going to share with you, I'm just thinking here, I'm going to share with you an overview of the study, the research questions that I asked, the case study methodology, methods analysis, and I'm going to share with you some preliminary findings. I'm actually not going to discuss recommendations, because at this stage I haven't had the opportunity to discuss the recommendations and the findings with the stakeholders at the university, who I really need to speak to first. So I won't be sharing that at this stage. Okay, so let's check in. So what I thought we would do, and in the spirit of this is about communities of practice, about dialogue and connection, I would like to invite you in a moment to stand up and find someone here that perhaps you haven't talked to for a while, all right? And you're going to ask them the first question. Think about your professional interests. What interest area would you like to advance with others in your workplace? Okay, I'll give you a moment to think about that. Is there an interest area that you have that you think, I'd really like to know how other people are addressing that, thinking about that, interpreting that, doing that. So is there an interest area you'd like to learn more about with other people? It's the first question. And the second one is, share a positive experience you've had learning with others. What happened? All right, so there's 2 rounds. I know you're probably expecting presentation, but I'm going to ask you to stand up. So the first round, find a partner, discuss question 1, and you've got a couple of minutes. And then I'll call time, and then you'll find another partner. Okay? All right, let's go. What kind of conversation did you have? Could you come up with some ideas and interests?
No,
Did it spark some ideas? Yeah. Now, I'm going to add some personal comment in this presentation, as well as, of course, sharing with you the data that I've collected and what I'm learning from this study. But certainly, studies have shown, there's been studies about faculty experience in universities, and there are many comments made about the individual nature of faculty work. You know, that faculty tend to teach alone. There's not so much collaborative work or co-teaching. That you tend to research alone. You might have some partners that you work with, but it tends to be something that's fairly solitary. Professional development is offered for individuals and also for communities, but it tends to have a tendency towards the individual perhaps, but that tends to be a pursuit that you do on your own. And so what's interesting to me in a university setting, in higher education, is how we might look at communities of practice as opportunities for social participation and social connection for faculty when there are these characteristics of very independent learning and scholarship. Right. So creating a community, the path to the study. Of course, I'm embedded in this study. It's a qualitative case study. And in my thesis and during my research, I've worked very hard to be reflexive at different points because I need to kind of separate myself from the study while recognizing that I'm a part of it as the researcher to some degree. But my interest in this study came from starting at Royal Roads and finding that I was struggling a little with the transition into my research, transitioning into my teaching, transitioning into professional development. And so I found personally that when I started to connect in my school and also outside my school with different people who had similar interests, that I started to feel much more confident, much more prepared, much more engaged, much more supported in the work that I was doing. So that's a little bit about my story. And the first community of practice that I was involved in is one called the Interdisciplinary Case Research Community of Practice that actually started in, I think it was 2015, early 2015. And when I got involved in that group, which kind of formed spontaneously, I started to, I think, I started to feel I was on track. You know, I started to get connected and feel that I could do this. You know, it was a pivotal moment for me. So that's a little bit about my story. So, as I mentioned, this is a practitioner thesis that I'm completing with the University of Liverpool for my doctorate. And so I was drawn to this research topic because I wanted to explore this phenomenon in more detail. And I was interested in exploring the phenomenon of communities of practice within the context of Royal Roads University. And so that's why I chose to undertake a case study and use that methodology for the research. So this is an exploration of faculty experience in informal faculty-initiated communities of practice. And I want to emphasize that they're faculty-initiated, so they're kind of ground up. So there isn't a request from the university to address a certain topic. They're very much generated from the ground up and kind of organic in the way that they formed. So I've decided to share with you a little bit about the theory, and I wanted to share with you, this is Etienne Wenger's theory social theory of learning that he developed in 1998. And I've used it because I'm using the concept community of practice, which I'm going to share with you in a moment. But this concept for Wenger came out of this social theory of learning that he developed in the late 90s. And so Wenger was very interested in learning as social participation. And he did some work with Jean Lav, and she's a social anthropologist, and he's an educational theorist. And they collaborated and developed the concept of communities of practice that I'll show in a moment. But the background to communities of practice is this social theory of learning and theories similar to it. And I feel it's important to remind ourselves of that theory that supports communities of practice, because for me, it's helped me understand what they are and what they aren't, and to be able to articulate how they contribute to individual and community learning. So learning as social participation, there are 4 components. Wenger suggested that this was an initial inventory, that this was a theory that could be adapted and changed and adjusted, and indeed it has. So he talked about coming together and learning together as an opportunity to impact identity. So this idea of learning as becoming. So in social participation with others, your sense of self, your sense of your understanding, your sense of identity can shift, can adjust. Practice, learning as doing. Social participation enables you to really discuss your practice. You know, how are you addressing problems, issues, research, and so on through your practice? So really acknowledging and recognizing practice is a very important form of learning. The 4th one, meaning, learning as experience. Well, a lot of our learning comes through not just the doing, but the talking, the thinking, the expressing, the feeling. So all of that is learning as experience. And then the 4th part is learning as belonging. So when we're in social participation with others and learning, we are also generating this sense of belonging, this feeling of community, this reciprocity, this sharing, this supporting that is quite different from individual learning. So what Wenger suggested is that a community of practice is the way you can action. It's the way of the catalyst for putting into motion this social theory of learning in the 4 areas that I just shared: meaning, experience, community, and participation. And so he said this all comes together when we create communities of practice. You know, all those 4 things can happen, do happen, and they relate to one another, right? And so he suggested that a community of practice is defined with 3 areas. The first one is that you have a domain of interest. So you have something you're passionate about, care about, want to advance. The second part is that it's a group of people that care about the other people in the community. So in other words, they want to support each other. They want to be there for each other. They want to ask each other questions. They want to really listen. They want to really be influenced and influence others. You know, that community piece was very important. And then the practice piece are that you're a group of people that share a practice. So we have, thank you, hello, hi Margot. So for example, our community of practice for administration, for administrative staff, they share a practice area, right? Case researchers share an area of practice. Women in leadership share an area of practice. And so these are the three components or pieces that represent a community of practice. Okay? Any questions so far? Okay. All right. So learning as a social practice, we're recognizing that it's a combination of your individual experience, what you bring to the group, and the competence that you create together as a community, learning with one another. So let's talk about the study for a moment. So that's a little bit about the background theory. So the research questions, I selected 4 research questions, and you can read them there. The first one was I just wanted to understand. So what I was noticing is that I was seeing different communities come together, developed by faculty members And so why was this happening? You know? What were people looking for when they joined? Okay. So that was the first question. The second question is, how do faculty members describe their learning in communities of practice? So I've shared with you that learning theory, social theory of learning, from Wenger. But how are our faculty members experiencing these groups? We're calling them communities of practice. Are they really? What's going on in these groups, and what is the faculty experience? Number 3, how do faculty members perceive the related impacts, potential risks, and benefits of participating in informal learning groups? And number 4, what are the common aspects that enable or impede the groups to function? So those were the 4 questions. Any questions for me at this point? Okay. All right. Now, I'm just going to go back, and just one other comment. Thriving in higher education. I mean, as we all have discussed, even just thinking about our response to climate change, there's an immense challenge for us to come together and learn in different ways. Communities of practice are one possibility to support that and to really generate innovation and learning and cross communication between schools and faculties. So that's one of the pieces that I found particularly interesting here, is that these communities are interdisciplinary. They're not generated out of one school. People coming together from across schools and faculties. All right. So the methodology, I explored the phenomenon of informal faculty communities of practice as perceived by faculty members in 3 communities of practice. So the program head community of practice, the women in leadership community of practice, and a community of practice for interdisciplinary case research. As I mentioned, it's a case study because it's investigating the phenomenon of communities of practice in a real-life context, which is, of course, the university and these 3 different groups. In exploring the literature and our understandings that relate to communities of practice, I looked at 4 major areas. The first area is the changing nature of faculty work. I was interested to understand if that had any relationship to these communities of practice coming together. The second major area I looked at was the practice of faculty professional development in higher education, and understanding faculty engagement in that process. The third was community of practice theory, and the fourth was organizational learning in universities. So those were the 4 areas that I looked at. But one thing I want to really note is that in this study, I really wanted to recognize the significance of the context of the university, but also the local conditions in each community of practice. So I've shared with you the 3 that were in the study, but I noticed that each of those has its own context, its own local conditions, its own flavor, And I love this magpie idea that, like a magpie with a nest, learning is built on the materials at hand in relation to the structuring of resources and local conditions. And as I participated in each of these 3 communities of practice, I did notice that the local conditions really did vary, and I think that's really quite fascinating. And it's really about the domain. What are you gathering together to discuss? Who's at the table? What kind of community do you want to create together? And how practice-based are your conversations? Are you talking about practice as developing knowledge? Are you talking about practice as doing? There were very different interpretations of practice. But those 3 groups developed really quite differently, as can be expected. So for this study, I completed, I had 2 research methods. And for the research questions, they were divided into 2 parts. So the first 2 research questions, I explored those with in-depth, semi-structured interviews. I really wanted to understand the individual experience of the different faculty members in their community of practice, and I felt that doing an in-depth interview was the most appropriate way to do that. So that was answering the question, why did they join the community? And the second question was how was their learning? How did they express their learning in those groups? So so I collected data on those two questions with in-depth, semi-structured interviews. And then for the second two questions, which were around benefits of the groups, barriers, how did the groups function, I chose to do focus groups because I wanted to really generate some, encourage idea generation and conversation in a moderated focus group for those two questions. Yeah.
Given that you're essentially a part of that community, how do you ensure your objectivity and maintain that objectivity throughout the process?
That's a really good question. It was challenging, actually. I had to think about it a lot. I wrote notes after each interview or focus group. I had audio recordings as well. So I was kind of thinking about that question a lot. And I chose to address the positionality, my positionality as a researcher throughout the whole study, at every stage. And I was very careful in the interviews to, kind of not interject or not kind of be sharing my particular, perhaps, impressions verbally or non-verbally. Although I do acknowledge that I am part of this study as the researcher, but I've worked quite hard to be really thoughtful around that and separate myself. Yeah, thank you. So I completed 9 in-depth interviews and 3 focus groups here on campus. So I thought what I would do is, I think we're okay for time, and I'd really like to invite your questions. We're a small group, and I know that many people have joined us because they're involved in communities of practice, or they have specific questions, or they're wondering how this research perhaps might inform their own work. So please do jump in and ask questions of me. Yes, go ahead, Maura. Yeah.
About the components slide.
Yeah.
Social theory, I think it's about 3 guys.
Yeah.
And on the components, I was just wondering if in the 4 quadrants, if they're weighted equally, or if one has mean heavier on the other.
Yeah.
If you don't have one, does it change things?
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if that came out in your in the findings. Maybe at the end there was something that is equal, or do they? Does it matter if you're missing something? So I look right at community and learning and belonging as like my first go-to space. And as a researcher, I have to really watch my limitations and be careful not to focus on one thing versus the other. So I'm interested in your journey on that.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So Wenger has argued that all 4 components are integral to a social learning. So the phenomenon of social learning requires all 4 of these components. So that's interesting to think about if you're involved in communities of practice and other forms of learning collectively, partnering, that these 4 need to be there. And I think what is sometimes missing with other forms of learning when there's people gathered together is, is the community piece there, for example? You could ask yourself, is the community piece there? Are we encouraging that sense of belonging, that sense of mutual support, that reciprocity, and so on? Or are we not, And if we're not, where are the opportunities to do that, and how could that really encourage and deepen the learning opportunities that we have when we bring people together or when people convene? Similarly, practice. Are we providing enough space for people to share their actual practice? What's actually happening? You know, what their experience of their work, for example, or their experience of their teaching, is there enough time and space made for people to really open up about what it's really like teaching a course, right? And what's working, what isn't, those kinds of things. So yes, the theory suggests that all four are integral to creating learning as social participation, and that the communities of practice are a catalyst for bringing these four areas together. Right. Thank you. It's a great question. So I'm going to share with you the four themes that emerged from they didn't emerge. I worked really hard on the coding theming of them, I would say. They didn't just appear. So I completed a thematic analysis. I followed Braun and Clark's thematic analysis 6-phase approach to theming qualitative data. And I coded and themed. And the research questions 1 and 2, the themes the data suggested to me were the 4 on the slide here. A, this space is freeing. B, this is a supportive community. C, this is a faculty learning space. And D, communities of practice fill gaps. So I'm just going to speak to some of these. I'll speak to this first one, and then depending on time, you can just let me know if there's any others you're particularly interested in. But let's take a look at theme A, this space is freeing. So in the interviews, the participants talked about the space feeling free. And it was a free, it felt different. So the example here of the quote, you are in a free setting, you're hearing different opinions, and you're allowing your thinking to evolve at a pace that is comfortable to you. So there was something about the communities offering more space and pacing that people felt supported their learning and their experience. The sub-themes are there is autonomy and choice, and there is goodwill. And the coding on the right, the codes that generated the themes were space to talk, the membership changes, I have a choice whether to attend, loose structure, free from cultural norms. So that's theme A, this space is freeing. Theme B, this is a supportive community. So the interview participants talked about feeling supported from their fellow community members. There was one exception to that, but overall. And they spoke about collegiality. You can see that you can read those quotes there in the orange.
Just have a question.
Yeah.
In terms of the institutional context,
Yeah.
within which you did this research,
Mm-hmm.
to what extent does this kind of analysis, particularly supportive communities, extend in a multi-institutional, situation where you're going outside and having a collectivity which may be online or some other way?
Right. Yeah. No. So these groups. So there are many communities that are online communities, or a combination of online and meeting. These groups did have some. They did create their information either through Moodle or other sites. So there was a way of having an online presence. What was interesting, though, is that the participants tended to very much focus on the person-to-person communication. They didn't really, in the interviews, they didn't speak to the information online. No one brought up the Moodle site at all. They talked about their one-on-one and community connections. So the participants really spoke to a community of practice providing the supportive space for them. That was very evident. The third one, this is a faculty learning space. So the participants really spoke to this being a professional development opportunity. They viewed it as professional development. They viewed it as a learning space. The sub-themes here are learning has impetus and purpose. Some members had different expectations of the group. There is learning through collaboration, and the community members noticed that they self-reflected. So there's quite a lot of conversation about this is a space where I can reflect on learning. That was a big piece. Any questions about any just instant thoughts or? Okay. And then the fourth theme, COPs fill gaps. So this notion that there was very interesting conversations from many people about the LTRM, and the participants often related communities of practice to the LTRM as something that, in terms of organizational learning, it was a way that we were practicing the LTRM within our own organization as faculty members, rather than looking at it, the LTRM, more from a teaching, how we teach in our courses and so on. They said, well, this is about us expressing this and exploring this internally as an organization. So that was part of the discussion. There was this sub-theme of it helping transition. So this depended some degree might be related to someone like myself when I shared about my story, being someone new to an organization, that idea of being a novice, really wanting to kind of get the lay of the land and really figure out my path and journey. That communities of practice did support those individuals. Okay. And then for research questions 3 and 4, these were the questions around the functionality of the groups, risks, benefits, and so on. There were 2 themes that came together. The first one, group process, was variable and emergent, and the groups are informal and fragile. So here we have group process was variable and emergent. So what I found is that in the focus groups, the participants talked about concern that the group might not continue. So there was definitely this concern about, well, I really, my main concern is, will it keep going? That was because the convening of the group tended to rest on 1 or 2 people, and so it really depended on those people carrying on. And also the questions and apprehensions regarding informal and formal attributes and what this means for a community of practice. So there's quite a lot of conversation about, some people wanted to have more formal components, and some people wanted to keep it very loose and organic and emergent. So that was interesting in terms of the functionality of the group.
Just a question.
Yeah.
Does this bring up any issues around leadership in these groups? If you've got such a disparate situation with people shifting all the time, although there's a great intent and interest in counting, circumstances, particularly in this place, indicate very often that you can't make it because you have other things.
Yeah, so great question, Brian. And what's really interesting with this is that, to my understanding, as I mentioned, communities of practice I see as generally more on certainly on the informal side, when we're looking about learning, and you have the formal, informal, if you want to look at it that way, very informal, more informal. Some groups are informal in the sense that they come together and they have conversations. I would think in our school, we have a community of practice that's informal. We don't necessarily have a leader that moves around. We see each other, we have a hallway chat, we have some shared interests. The school, we kind of, you could argue that we have an informal community of practice, and we don't necessarily have a leader in all of those conversations. They just happen with who's there, and you share and talk. When we look at encouraging communities of practice within organizations, then we're moving towards looking at how do we convene them, like how do we support them and encourage them to develop. And there are many different sectors that have done that successfully. Higher education, the research suggests that we're a little behind, interestingly, in that area of supporting communities of practice, although not in all areas. So scholarship of teaching and learning is an area that has made a lot of progress with communities of practice. So looking at Sophia there, but, so it's really a mixed bag. There are certain interests and disciplines that have built communities of practice more as something that people think about and do as a form of organizational learning or professional development, whereas in other areas they're less talked about, less understood, less practiced. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could go back
Yeah, sure.
to the slide that had the 3 areas. So
Yeah.
we've got the domain of interest, the
Yes.
community, and then the practice. And
Yes.
I believe that's been represented in the literature as a
Yes.
triad.
Yeah.
So what's emerging for me is perhaps this
Yeah.
triad doesn't necessarily reflect what your research participants, the responses of research participants.
Yeah.
For example,
Yeah.
the practice and interest for me
Yeah.
seem to almost blend in together.
Mm-hmm.
And so my question to you
Yeah,
is,
yeah.
after completing this research,
Yeah.
if you were to articulate a framework
Yeah.
for communities of practice,
Yeah.
would it look like this triad? What would you replace? So if you were to
Mhm.
combine the domain of interest with practice,
Yeah.
what would you replace as the third component? Or what would it look like? Like, would you change it entirely?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say, first of all, well, thank you for the question. I wouldn't want to kind of present that without talking to you and talking to a lot of other stakeholders here at the university. And I think some people miss that initial part. Like, I'm not really speaking to recommendations because as people I would certainly, there's so many stakeholders here I'd want to have involved in that conversation. Based on the literature and the data, to give you an answer, some kind of sense of an answer, is that I see that there are different ways to do this, and the literature suggests, faculty learning communities, I've written about those in the thesis, they tend to be more structured. They have an organizational mandate, typically. They have a start period and an end period. They have structured times for meeting. They're more there's a clearer path with them and how they're structured. And those could be very, very much developed here at Royal Roads, I feel, like faculty learning communities. And then there's also the communities of practice that are more informal. And so there's a university in Australia that has a program for both. So they have the more structured form of communities of practice, and they call them faculty learning communities and distinguish them differently. And those have a sponsor as well. They have a certain organizational mandate, a reason for joining. And then the other stream is more organic, and those are encouraged as well. So I want to chat with a group of people and come together over the next 6 months and talk about an aspect of my professional work. I could just do that. And there's some recognition of that form of community of practice as well, and encouragement for that to happen. So I see that there's a way to accommodate all of this and support all of this, because it's all important. And I see in the literature, there's the criticism of this form or that form, and how formal should they be, or how structured should they be? If they're structured, are they really communities of practice? It's an interesting conversation, but I don't recommend that for our university. If I was to make a recommendation, I would say embrace it all and figure out how to create streams of this so that it suits different approaches. I hope that's okay. So thanks everyone. I'm just closing in. So this was the last one. Groups are informal and fragile. So you can see some of those quotes. I do believe it's seen as peripheral, and it would not have been involved had I not already got continuing status. That was interesting. All right. In my view, what will drive success is that I found my tribe and there's a community here. Right? So that support, that community part. And it was so organic, it was like we're just coming together and we're going to talk. If there'd been more structure, it might not have been as easy. So this person is really appreciating the unstructured, informal component. So everyone, thank you for hanging in with me. It's 12:47. So I'm just going to finish. So these are the 4 areas that I am looking at in terms of findings. As I mentioned, I am working on the recommendations and conclusions in the thesis currently, and I really look forward to having further conversations with the community on the recommendations and the data. So faculty COP members were motivated by the opportunity to join a faculty-initiated, horizontally organized community of practice. So that was one of the key findings. The second one, learning in a community of practice had 5 characteristics. So we talked about, so what is learning in our faculty communities of practice? And the characteristics were personal choice, so I choose, right? Engaging purpose, right, is something I really care about, it's interesting to me, something I'm working on, has immediate relevance. Oops. Oh, there we go. I get mutual support. I feel like I'm learning with others and other people are supporting my learning. I'm not going at this alone. You know, I can ask questions, I can not know the answers, I can share, and we're in this together because we all care about this area of interest. We collaborate with one another, and I see collaboration as how can I help you, how can you help me, what can we do together, are there things that I can do to support you, or you'll be there to support me. And then the reflection. Many faculty members discussed this space as a place that was deeply reflective, which is very interesting to me. It was a space where they could reflect with others and individually too. Number 4, in terms of broad-based findings, is informal faculty COPs facilitate relationship building for faculty across disciplines and schools. That came through the data consistently. I like meeting other people, learning with other people. I get a different perspective on case writing when I learn that approach in communication. Oh, we do it this way in business. Oh, but how can I learn from business? I like the way business writes cases. I want to write cases for communication and teaching the way business does. Interesting, right? Those kinds of things. So that interdisciplinary learning, but also very much relationship building. And then in each group negotiated the organizational, social, and political context differently. They have very different negotiations, and that depended on the domain of interest, really. So the program head community of practice, it had different structural conditions that it was working within in terms of discussing that practice. Then, for example, the case research, because really there aren't any structural conditions that you're working with when you're in a case research community of practice, right? Those aren't really part of the conversation. It's about becoming a better case writer. Whereas when the program head, conversations around the program head work and being a program head, there were components that really were outside of the influence of the individuals. And in closing, speaking, for example, to program head, one thing that really happened in that program head community of practice is that the research participants talked about how the group enabled them to recognize their work and value their work and realize how much they contribute. It was kind of a reaffirmation of the work that they did in that role, which is really productive. So. Thank you very much, everyone. That's a quick review.